Today we have Andrew Bustamante.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Hey, I'm good, Darren. Thanks for having me back.
Can you give us like an introduction of yourself and like what you have done in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a former covert CIA intelligence officer. I left CIA in 2014 to join corporate America, kind of get my chops in the real world, and then launched my own business in 2019. And since then, have been running my own business, everydayspy.com. And we've had tons of fantastic growth as a consultancy to ultra high net worth, to corporate businesses, to the very rich, and then also in our own work to kind of be an educational platform through digital trainings and live events.
So I noticed there's often a lot of skeptics that will like reply to your videos and stuff and say that you're a plant or you're a psyop or something like that. I wonder if you could just like kind of address that and what would be a good response to somebody that is a skeptic.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do. A true skeptic can't be challenged. And that's a really important thing to understand. That's something they teach us at CIA. When somebody has kind of taken the steps to condition their brain to the point where they do not accept any alternative explanation other than what they've landed on, that's what you call a true skeptic, right? So someone who's skeptical about God, someone who's skeptical about finances, someone who's skeptical about the government. These are people who can never be changed. They'll be skeptics the rest of their life. So I don't even bother trying to speak to or reply to the skeptics because it's a game of diminishing returns. But what I will say is for the people out there who read what the skeptics have to say and have yet to kind of land on their own conclusion about me, the truth is that when you can't claim to be from CIA unless you are officially separate from CIA. There's all sorts of rules and laws out there that make it so you can't impersonate a CIA officer, and also make it so that if you're an active CIA officer, your affiliation is something that can't be disclosed without, going through a number of different hoops. So, so me being a CIA plant, someone who's still with CIA but saying I'm from CIA, would essentially be me lying to the American people with CIA's thumbs up of approval, and that makes it that crosses all sorts of legal boundaries that aren't possible. So whether or not that I do have a very positive message about CIA, I really enjoyed my time there. So I don't make any apologies about my pro national security, pro CIA approach. That's just who I am, and that's me being honest. That doesn't mean we didn't do stupid shit in the past, but it does mean that my time there was very positive. It doesn't mean I'm trying to recruit for CIA or run a psyop on people or any of that garbage. It does mean that I'm being honest about my time and my service there, and trying to be as honest as I can about all the good and bad things that happen there.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting that you say that, because there are a few other people that I follow that say that they were ex-CIA, and now that just added validity to what they said. So the one thing that I wanted to ask you was, so I've noticed Janet Yellen, Blinken, Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, which is over 100 years old, are all flying to China, and like Kissinger is like literally risking his health to get to China to talk to Xi. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things happening there that you're seeing, Darren, right? So the first is you're very much seeing that, and I think that Kissinger is a fantastic example. Kissinger did an interview with The Economist, which is a British newspaper, British periodical, about maybe 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago. And in that article, he expressed how his recommendation to the US federal government was essentially to let negotiations between the US and China take those kind of outside of government and let them be done by non-government entities, so that governments can continue to kind of posture and share the existing kind of negative message with the American people or with the Chinese people, while this second kind of separate group gets a chance to try to de-escalate conflict from inside. So I'm not surprised that Kissinger, who would essentially make the recommendation to have like this front office, back office, public, private, discourse with China, I'm not surprised that he would make that statement and then be part of that team. And really, that's what we're seeing. And this strategy is very successful. The Cuban Missile Crisis was essentially averted because of the ability to have diplomatic conversations in back channels, while the face of the government was able to still maintain their existing posture with their own population. And unfortunately, we've seen this crash course between China and the United States, where neither country, to their own population, neither country can really go forward and say, hey, you know what, guys? We're going to change our approach, and we're going to de-escalate conflict with each other, and we're going to be friends again. We're too far gone. We can't do that realistically while also maintaining any kind of respect or trust between the population and the government that oversees them. So now we have to rely on back channel communications to de-escalate and prevent a disaster. And that's really what the US and China are marching towards progressively right now, is some kind of misunderstanding that could lead to a worldwide disaster.
Yes, and you're seeing headlines almost daily about something. I believe right before we started this, there was a headline that was the Chinese defense was urging the U.S. to stop sending ammunition or weapons to Taiwan, right? And it seems to be inching its way closer and closer and closer. So it's definitely a hot button issue.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if you just recap headlines from even this week, Darren, I think it was a $316 million weapons package was approved by the U.S. government to go to Taiwan. That's a ton of weaponry going to a small country that is not currently in any kind of conflict. And, oh, by the way, we're sending it to a country that we don't even recognize as a country. According to the US official policy, Taiwan is a system of government that falls within the larger country of China, right? One country, two systems. So what exactly is it that we're approving? It looks to China like we're approving essentially like a splinter government to resist the leanings and position of its master government. To the United States, we kind of tell our American people, oh no, we're supporting Taiwan, an independent nation. Neither of those things is really 100% true. Also in headlines this week was that Japan is doubling the amount of GDP they dedicate to their own military, because they're concerned about ongoing collaboration and cooperation between the Russian military and the Chinese military. So if you think about it, Japan, who is, quite possibly America's closest ally, right? It's between the UK and Japan, depending on how you look at it. Japan is now so concerned by the conflict by the power rising in its own backyard, that it's doubling the amount of money it invests in a defense force that since World War II has been intentionally repressed according to the laws and outlines that came from the peace treaty following World War II, right? So what concerns me more than anything else is that when you kind of read the tea leaves, what you're seeing is that the people who are closest to China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, these countries are massively increasing their military spending budgets. They're massively increasing their ability to arm and protect themselves. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we're still trying to act as though, we're the predominant power and there's nothing to worry about from China. We even still have geopolitical analysts and talking heads who are saying that China's on the brink of decline, on the brink of collapse, right? If that's true, how is it that so many neighboring nations are literally up in arms, defending themselves to protect against this rising global threat?
Also, to that point, all over the Asia Pacific, right? There's U.S. military bases with U.S. troops. One of the islands, Palau, is a it's independent nation, but they have ties to the U.S. The U.S. protects Palau, and with all respect to the Palau people, what intrigues me about this is I read The Economic Hitman by John Perkins, right? And it seems like it's one of those types of deals where we protect Palau, and they're able to get our military aid as well as other benefits. And it turns out that Palau is really crypto friendly right now, and they're starting to give out digital residencies, and they're starting to make, since they have a dollar, it's not exactly a CBDC, but it is a dollar that they're issuing on a public ledger. So they're putting it on a crypto asset. So I could use the Palau dollar on the XRP ledger. This is right out in the open. Anyone can use it. And to me, when I interviewed the guy that was the head of this project, he told me he works very closely with the Treasury and the Fed to make sure that this is going on. So the geopolitical landscape, right? The U.S. presence in the Asia Pacific, to me, it seems like they're testing a new technology on soldiers. And I just kind of wanted soldiers and also the Palau people, and it does bring a lot of benefits. I'm wondering if this is kind of like a test bed for a digital dollar. How would that look like? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong at all. I would say it's more than just a test bed, though, right? If you consider the U.S. and what the U.S. has to lose. So the United States is the undisputed economic superpower of the planet. Nobody argues that. Nobody argues that today in 2023. Everybody argues whether or not they're going to retain that financial power in 2030, 2035, right? The backbone of the American GDP is in financial services. In excess of $2 trillion a year are import-export productive revenue that comes to and through the United States, which is about 8% of all GDP of the United States, comes just from financial services. Financial services don't manufacture anything. They don't cost any kind of, raw material, natural resource. They barely even have labor costs, right? We're just talking about innovations and technology that we create and we control that handle the transactions of the world. The UK has modeled itself off of the United States and become essentially the financial services capital of Europe. So our success, basically making money off of the handling of money, is what has made us a superpower, and it's what has made the UK a leading institution, a small country with a very large GDP. When you look at China, what is China trying to do? In Asia, the exact same thing. Predominantly, the center of financial power has been Hong Kong. Well, guess what China ingested in 2019? Hong Kong, right? So you can see China is trying to follow suit and replicate the same model that it saw in the UK and the US. So now that we're on the verge of a new kind of currency, cryptocurrency, once again, we have this technology that nobody debates and nobody says will not rule the future. Everybody is looking at cryptocurrencies as the direction of the future, digital currencies as the future. The question is just, how will they be implemented? How will they be used? How will they be valued? Now, the US can't afford to just reject it outright, especially not when the UK and China are two countries that are actively taking steps to adopt and implement some sort of active digital currency or cryptocurrency, even a CBDC, right? What the US has to do is find a way to test, implement, and familiarize the American people with a digital currency that the US controls. And the US wants to control a digital currency because the number one reserve currency in the world is the US dollar. 60% of all currency reserves anywhere in the world are held in US dollars. That's more currency in dollars than bricks of gold, right? The transactions that are carried out in federal and US dollars and euros combined make up 90% of all transactions in the world. The US does not want to lose that predominant financial sector position. So they have to find a digital solution, and they have to find it quickly, but they have to find it like in a secure, high probability for success manner. And that, Darren, I think is exactly why they're looking at Palau. I think you're nailing it exactly on the head. Palau is a US protectorate. Palau is tied to the US dollar. Palau is digital and crypto friendly. And frankly, Palau it's a poor country. There's nothing there. So if they can make it work digitally as an experimental location, if they can make a digital dollar, specifically a digital dollar, work in Palau, then they have a way of making the digital dollar work everywhere else in the world. And I'm going to take a break there, even though there's so much more to talk about because of Palau's connection to the Palau stablecoin and the Palau stablecoin's connection to Ripple and how that makes Ripple itself a stablecoin. There's so much there to dig into, but I just want to give myself a chance to breathe and you a chance to comment.
So the XRP Ledger, you can issue anything, and you can make an account. You could be a gateway like a bank does, and you can issue anything. You can issue bars of gold. You can issue an hour of labor, right? And somebody can hold the hour of labor, and it has these it has these specific properties that kind of replicate what banking does. And there's something called rippling that would really enhance the banking experience. And if you were to replace, the banking system as it is to something that's on a transparent ledger that has those properties, the banking system itself would become much more efficient, and there would be when you use the Palau dollar that's on the XRP ledger, you have to have a certain amount of XRP. It's natively paired to XRP. You have to burn a small amount, a minute amount, so it's like a fraction of a penny, right? So that's kind of how the technology itself works. But the whole banking thing, right? They're going for like an ESG compliant type of outlook, right? And so that the major cryptocurrencies, there's all these flaws with their consensus mechanisms that make them really energy wasteful. So the XRP Ledger has some unique properties that suit this very well. So that's kind of one thing that I wanted to mention. But it's weird that you say this though, because bureaucrats have been fighting with Ripple. All right. The SEC has sued Ripple. And at the same time, there are now projects that the SEC is approving of. And these projects are funded by companies that are China, China native type of projects where Hashkey Group got heavy ties into China. And it looks like there's almost favoritism towards the innovation with China-funded projects. At the same time, Ripple is getting, hit by bureaucrats. So, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're dead. You're dead right. The SEC has been resistant to Ripple, I want to say, for the better part of the last 3 years, 4 years. It's been a long time that they've been resisting Ripple. And over that period of time, Ripple has been adopted by financial institutions in the Middle East. It backs multiple projects out of Dubai. It's the foundation for multiple projects out of Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia. You've also seen Ripple get adopted by multiple banks in Italy and some luxury brands in Italy. Like I think the most recent one I saw was Ducati. And what more than it being, I think, like a Chinese influence or some sort of strategic play, I think what it is that other countries are seeing the incredible advantage to onboarding with XRP early and using it early, because transparency in the global financial institutions is a net benefit for everyone. Being able to reveal what's really happening on the ledger is something that benefits all major financial institutions in the world. And Dubai relies on that. Saudi Arabia relies on that. China relies on that. The UK relies on that, which is why you saw the most recent, you saw King Charles pass the bill that made digital currency legal or ISO compliant or whatever it was in the UK. You also saw ISO 222 come through that basically said that Ripple, along with a few others, are compliant, just like you were saying. So the SEC is now in a position where it's the concerns it had from 3 or 4 years ago may no longer be relevant, but they move at the speed of government. So they have to kind of figure out what they're going to do. And it's a lot of that SEC pressure that has negatively impacted the world's understanding of XRP. But it's also been what's made kind of a negative reputation of cryptocurrency, I think, throughout the US writ large. People don't realize that cryptocurrency as a tool for enhancing security and as a tool for enabling transparency within our existing banking structure, that's an option too. It's not just decentralizing and hiding money. It's not just decentralized finance that takes money out of the banks or puts it into individual control of each individual user. Like, those are benefits of some cryptocurrencies, but others are built exclusively to facilitate faster, more transparent transactions.
Yeah, and the innovation keeps continuing. You know, there are useful projects that are adding to economic activity, right? If you're able to take trade finance, for example, there's actually laws where you need a pen ink signature on like bills of lading and stuff. So the entire, the entire financial system, right? You saw all these like private permission type of systems being built, and now like finally they're starting to push it into the open public ledgers, and the open public ledgers have a much more advantages. It's like the intranet versus the internet. When you have these really permission systems, it causes problems. So I just found it weird that the SEC, if they are in ties with them, why is the SEC going after them? But I guess the government's kind of decentralized to begin with, right? I was just talking to a guy from Constellation. He's working with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force, and he's still worried about the SEC, right? So, like, you have all these projects, Lockheed and Martin, right? The Filecoin is working with Lockheed and Martin. Raytheon, right? You see these names and board members of crypto projects, and there's very few of them, but they're sitting there, right, in plain sight. So it's kind of like the government is kind of decentralized to begin with. You have all these different hands getting involved with one technology. So
yeah, the thing that's important to understand about the federal government is that the US government is run by very well-intentioned people, but that doesn't mean that they are the most knowledgeable or the most capable people. And I understand that that's contrary to what most people think, that people believe that, like, well, surely only the best of the best are at CIA, and only the best of the best are, make it to the Supreme Court, and only the best of the best become senators and congresspeople. I would hope that when you really think it through, you realize that's not the case at all. Well-reasoned, like well-meaning, well-intentioned patriots make a career in the government. But that doesn't mean that they're the ones who know the most about a certain technology, an emerging technology, finances, financial solvency, best practices in the banking system. It just means that they care a lot about their country, so they're making the sacrifices to build a career in public service. When you look at the board members, like you're saying, Darren, when you look at the board members who are supporting some of these crypto projects, it's extremely telling, because you see people who actually represent the private sector, but who are extremely familiar with how government works. So these are the people who straddle those lines. You mentioned Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. I also want to throw out there Mantech, SAIC, Booz Allen, right? These are publicly held companies that understand how government works. They're 1 foot into government, essentially, in terms of their influence, but they're very much capitalist, bottom line, revenue-driven companies. So they very much understand the importance and the value of emerging cutting-edge technology and the economic advantage that those technologies bring to the table. So they want to have a foot in both camps. Also, to your point about how can the SEC be, carrying out investigations on one hand, but then approving projects on the other hand, this is one of those areas where our government is really murky. Companies can essentially, any company, whether it's an LLC or a partnership or an incorporated company, they're each treated as individuals through the eyes of the law, right? Independent entities. So I could have a company. I do have a company. I have a company that's an LLC. And within my company, I have multiple subsidiaries within one major company. So now if something goes wrong with, say, my Everyday Spy brand, that is isolated from the larger umbrella company. That's how businesses run. That's how businesses are able to have corporate mergers and acquisitions. And that's why it is that some, nefarious companies can basically just be sued on Monday and open a new business on Tuesday. It's how, some people abuse the system, but it's also how you create a resilient and multifaceted, multidisciplined company. So your Booz Allens and your Raytheons and your Mantecs and your Boeings, they have exactly that structure. A major umbrella company with multiple subsidiaries that are independent entities underneath them, and each entity is essentially a unique case through the eyes of the law. And SEC is there to enforce the law. So they have to look at each of those entities separately. So what issues they may have with Boeing's military cyber division don't apply to Boeing's commercial aviation division. And that's just that's the way it works in the US. That's the way that we've evolved over time, whether it's for well or for ill. But that's how you see these things that seem like hypocrisy. But at the same time, we're able to continue to move that experimental line forward over and over again. It's a huge advantage that we have over a place like China.
Before we continue the show, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Even if you dislike this video, please leave a comment anyway telling me what you didn't like about it. I have subscription services. This is where I post information. I dig through a ton of PDFs, videos, podcasts, obscure information, and I try to extract relevant information. I often find documentation that later becomes news. For example, I found Ripple that bought Bitstamp before that became news. But it's not just curated information. Together, we have years and decades worth of experience in the markets, as well as technologists that understand the technology at a greater, deeper level. So my community not only has seasoned investors to noobs, but technologists. And we all get together and kind of try to make sense of the markets each week. Now, I'm not going to lie. It's not like we get it right 100% of the time. We are not gurus or anything like that. However, a lot of people find a lot of value in it. So join today. The links are in the description below.
Well, the regulatory capture, right, the revolving door of big business back to government, some would argue that's fascism, right? Like to have state and big corporate and government merge. Do you share that thought that it would be umbrellaed under fascism?
No, I don't share that thought at all. And a big part is because we live in a capitalist market where if there is no value in the service being provided, then there is no market to buy the service, right? We have examples of corruption for sure. We have examples of people supporting each other because they're riding on each other's coattails, or conspiracies, and there's a specific word, cronyism. We have examples of this for sure from history, and even here in the United States, especially if we go back to like the oil baron days, we have examples of all of those things. But keep in mind, we also have a market that shatters those paradigms, right? We had a market that ended the oil monarchies. We have a market that continually challenges, the Facebook empires, the Twitter empires, the Google empires of the world. And that's just because the market is driven by individual buyers in a capitalist system. So do I think that the revolving door of big business feeding government is a bad thing? I do not, especially because if we didn't have government being fed by big business, the only thing left would be government being fed by government, and there would be no evolution. There would be no growth. There would be no transformation.
Well, that's a very unique perspective, and that's the first time I've heard something like that. So I appreciate that thought. That's a very interesting outlook on it. So the company Prometheum that seems to be getting special treatment with the SEC. One of the CEOs of the parent group that invested in it. He's really an advocate for trustless technologies. As a matter of fact, I've had some of his people contact me to tell me that, we're going down the wrong path. This isn't some China versus US Cold War tech thing. It is because he truly believes in the technologies, and he really wants to see this come forth. And Dr. Feng Chao has written a lot of papers that are very similar to what I say in my channel. I really think this trustless technology is an olive branch between the West and the East, or, this multipolar world that we're having. A lot of the frictions could be resolved if you look back at, some of the accusations Trump made towards China about manipulating their currencies. With transparent ledgers, there's a lot of benefits that come from that. So I'm wondering if that makes sense to have, right now the IMF, the World Bank are kind of fitting that role as the middleman between countries. If you wipe that out and just put in a trustless technology that you didn't have to trust the IMF or you didn't have to trust the US, I think that would be a more peaceful system. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree. It would be a more peaceful system, but you're assuming that the world wants peace, and that's not what the world wants, right? What you've got to understand, we are taught very early on at CIA that the human race, beyond education, beyond cultural identity, beyond anything else, we are a race that's very focused on survival, right? We want to survive. And when our survival needs are met, then we have the option, we give ourselves the option to share or to collaborate or cooperate. But when our survival needs are not met, then we usually take action, and all of a sudden the morality of whatever we believe takes a back seat so that we can take whatever action we deem necessary. Governments are really just an amalgam of the human beings that they represent. So when you're looking at the government of the United States or the government of China, they're focused on survival, not the survival of each individual citizen, but the survival of the government, which is the stand-in identity of a person. So they become, if they have excess, if all of their survival needs are met, then they share, they collaborate, they cooperate. But when their survival is challenged, then all of that goes away. A trustless technology, true transparency, would make it so that you and I could potentially see everything about each other's lives. And that makes it so that our ability to have an advantage, our ability to get ahead, our ability to develop some kind of efficiency that we capitalize on ourselves, that gives us excess resources, that takes us further away from that, survival need status and into an abundant status, that becomes transparent to everybody. You would think that that's a good thing, but in reality, when a squirrel stores all of its acorns for the winter, the more acorns it stores, the more it feels threatened, because it recognizes that all the squirrels around it that don't have enough acorns are looking at its fat stock of acorns. And that's the same thing that's happening between the United States and China. We understand that the more we grow, the more we hold, the more attractive we become as a target to others. Trustless technology would make it so that everybody could see who's holding the most acorns. And that's going to be what informs future threats in trying to steal those acorns. So it actually challenges our basic survival needs, our basic ability to have privacy and obfuscate what resources we truly possess. So yes, you're right. It would make us a more peaceful world, a more peaceful civilization, because people would know exactly what each other has. And it would be very hard for it'd be hard for me to say, Darren, can I borrow $5? When I can look in your account and say, because you have $25 that you don't need. You don't want that. You want to be able to keep your money to yourself because you're like, oh, maybe I want to buy something nice for a girl or for a kid or for my nephew or whatever else. That's one of the big reasons why, countries don't want peace. Countries want dominance so that they can have that security of excess.
Well, you bring up a good point, because a lot of these designs, right, they've gone from having everything out in the open, and I've read reports where they loved it, but they wanted privacy. They absolutely needed privacy within the bank. They could not share any of that information. They loved the technology, but the privacy part. So when they digitize and create new public silos and these private permission systems, like they could kind of all interconnect, like the internet that we have today. When you go into Gmail, not everyone can read your Gmail account, right? So there's a purpose for those siloed systems that were very public. Like in 2017, that was the thing that caused everyone to go nuts. It was like all the R3s and the hyperledgers making all these private types of systems. So what you say makes sense too from like a technological point of view. You can have the privacy and the open ledger, and the open ledger serves a certain purpose while the other permission private silos serve another purpose, which that's how they're kind of designing it. So I wanted to ask about just the BRICS nations in general. Like, do you think there's any type of success rate for the BRICS to just branch off from natural resources? Like, they have a huge amount of natural resources. And I was looking at Visual Capitalists and shows a trend of GDP versus the G7. And it looks like BRICS are going to really outperform in GDP. So it looks like they're gaining dominance. Is this a concern for you?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point and a fantastic question, Darren. And I've seen that same visual capitalist graph that you're talking about. And it's important to understand that in terms of raw GDP, the BRICS nations are still trailing the G7 nations. It's really when you look at it through the triple P, right? The pricing parity. When you look at it through pricing parity, you start to see that the BRICS countries have more purchasing power than the G7 countries. And a lot of that is because of their abundance of natural resources, like you were saying, Darren. A short answer to your question is yes, I absolutely think that if you're not paying attention to the BRICS nations right now, you are falling way behind in terms of what the future is going to look like. The idea that the conflict of the future is between the United States and China, if that's your idea, you're missing the point. It has nothing to do with single independent superpowers anymore. It has to do with economic dominance. The United States has had economic dominance for the last 70 some years, and it's used its economically dominant position to essentially repress all of its closest allies, right? That's why NATO is essentially forced to defer to whatever the United States wants to do. Because the NATO militaries, NATO weapons, NATO economies, NATO trade are heavily tied to the United States. And that's something that the United States learned how to do coming out of World War II. They oppressed Germany, they oppressed Japan, they forced their governments, they forced lending on these countries that were demolished coming out of World War II, and made them dependent on the US dollar, made them dependent on US manufacturing and US trade. And then we reaped the benefits of that for the better part of 60 years. But then in the last 10 to 15 years, what we've seen is that other countries have started modeling our same approach, specifically Russia and China. The Belt and Road Initiative, outreach to Africa, outreach to areas of deep natural resources like the Bahamas, Central America, East Asia. And as these countries, specifically Russia, India, and China, as they've started to develop their own stronger economies, instead of competing with each other, they decided to band together and create this trading bloc called the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now you've got this cooperative group that shares resources, shares economic capacity, but doesn't force one another to adhere to any specific political principles. That's what makes them so different than the United States, which forces other countries. If you want to be allies with the United States, you basically have to play by our rules. Look at how Saudi Arabia has stood up to that. President Biden was elected on a campaign that promised that he would separate the US from Saudi Arabia. Instead, now in 2023, we have some of the closest relationships we've ever had with Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia continues to grow in its proximity to China and Russia and India as well. So the US strategy has been overplayed, and people understand it now. And they understand that you no longer have to choose be friends with America and pay the penalty of doing things the American way. Now they have this option of, or you can go to these BRICS country, the BRICS trading bloc, where they're not going to police your internal policies and your internal politics, but they will still bring you the advantages of economic diversity. The BRICS is how Russia repaired the ruble after the United States and the West put sanctions on the Russian economy, right? The BRICS is how India and China have essentially been able to separate themselves from the United States, even though they've still been able to benefit from economic trade with the United States. And now that the BRICS is talking about launching their own currency, the last time we saw this was when the euro was launched. And the euro really changed the marketplace quite a bit, the currency marketplace. If the BRICS successfully launch a new currency, which they're talking about doing as early as this month, if they launch a new currency and that currency is specifically pegged to gold, now you have a new world currency that multiple countries around the world would be interested in using because they want to do business with the BRICS, and it becomes independent of the US dollar, which is a floating currency not pegged to anything, that has really kind of let people down in the last 3 or 4 years as we've printed more money, given away more money, and we don't really have a way of repairing the status of the US dollar. So to give the world an option between the US dollar or a gold-backed currency that's adopted by this large coalition of countries known as BRICS, that's a challenge, a major challenge to the economic dominant position, not just of a country like China or US, but of groupings of countries, coalitions of countries, which frankly is the next evolution of the human race. After you go from being the strongest person, you then start to group yourself with other strong people to make a strong tribe. So you can kind of see how, again, that human behavior is being reflected in geopolitics and economics.
That's interesting that you say that. But I mean, if BRICS have a gold-backed stable coin, let's say, there's a counterparty. Who's holding the gold? How do you trust Russia, right? Like China, Russia, they've all been caught kind of manipulating and doing stuff where you really can't trust each other. You might band together and you might fight back. But that's the point that I think a lot of people miss with crypto assets in general, is that there's no counterparty. You don't have to worry about a counterparty. The counterparty is the tokens on the ledger. So, you can't, if BRICS had their gold reserve somewhere, right, you would have to trust that they would actually make good on their gold. And that's not exactly something that you could do, right? Switzerland played that role at one point. But you would really need to have another Switzerland. And Switzerland right now has sanctioned Russia, right? We've sanctioned Russia. We adding to the confidence loss in our currency to begin with. And I really think that's shooting ourselves in the foot, and we continue to do it. As a matter of fact, I believe there's an African country that was, and I'm not trying to be political at all. My point of view is purely economic. You want people to use your currency. So sanctioning an African country because of their internal policy is something that is a loss of confidence again. So it seems like we're in this downward spiral. And do you agree or disagree?
No, I agree with you. I agree with you that we are in this downward spiral because we're still applying a strategy that's outdated. This worked. This worked very well in the 80s and 90s, right? Reprimanding a country and cutting it off from trade with the US was a game changer in 1982. But now in 2022, people just take their oil somewhere else. They just take their goods somewhere else, right? And that's you're dead right that we're shooting ourselves in the foot is a fantastic way of putting it. We're just a petulant child that still wants their way. They want ice cream at dessert and they're not getting it and they're throwing a fit. And they don't realize that the fit isn't going to get them any more ice cream, right? I think you're also making a fantastic point when you talk about the trust and the confidence of the BRICS nations, because you're right. Who's going to trust that Russia and China are being honest? That's part of the reason why Russia and China have partnered with places like Brazil, South Africa, and India, because you kind of, in groups, you gain a little bit more confidence. I may not trust the Chinese, but the Indians seem to have, a pretty, standing a history of being able to grow their economy without having to turn to the same kind of nefarious tactics the Chinese have. But we're also talking about two different types of infrastructures and industries. If you're doing business with the BRICS, it's very different than doing business with the G7 countries. You're dealing in a world of raw materials and logistics and manual labor and manufacturing. With the G7 countries, you're dealing with financial services and technology and innovation. So it's not that one is better than the other. It's more like you've got a different tolerance for risk between the two, both of which could be resolved with a trustless system like what you're talking about, Darren. And I wouldn't be surprised if a group like the BRICS turns to a trustless system faster than an independent nation with a monopoly in terms of financial services like the United States, because the BRICS has more to gain and less to lose if they do introduce some kind of trustless technology. However, to your point, they're most likely going to introduce a technology that's one of their own homegrown technologies. And we'll always question how trustless is the Chinese auditing system, or how trustless is a cryptocurrency developed, by Russians.
Well, there's an interesting footnote. The Atlantic Council put out a paper that noted that Russia's central bank was testing the XRP ledger, and it fit certain criteria. As long as like one or two check marks got checked, it would be a good fit for them. With China, there has been very little American activity for a while, and then all of a sudden American Express, which was a RippleNet partner, Linlin Pay, which was also a RippleNet partner, Tranglo, they all sort of got regulatory approval from the PBOC. So, it's hard for me not to connect dots, but I do see the dots, and I start drawing the lines, but I know they're dotted lines, not necessarily lines. They're dotted lines. So I often see that. So, but there is footage of the NSA talking about interviewing Satoshi when they were going after the Silk Road. They went to California, and they said they were talking to four people. There's a woman from the NSA that was at a conference talking about that. Do you think Satoshi is a known person by the NSA? They know who he is, and they could go and visit him at any point if they wanted to.
I don't have a good answer for that personally. I don't know enough about the Bitcoin universe, the Bitcoin world. Where I spend my time looking at cryptocurrency is very much in the types of currencies, the type of crypto innovation that's going to facilitate and evolve our current financial system, not the kind of cryptocurrency that's challenging or positioning itself as a replacement to our financial services system.
Yeah, I do as well. That's something that it's not what I'm consistently looking at. There are extreme benefits if you compare to legacy banking or trade finance, like I spoke earlier about. So one of my friends wanted me to ask you what your thoughts about the Hunter-Joe Biden relationships with business, with the Russian collusion. Do you think that's actually factual, or is that just some type of media spin on it?
No, I would say the American people would probably be shocked if they realized how closely connected their political leaders were with hostile foreign nations. Because the way that, some people know this, some people don't. Like your average congressperson makes about $250,000 a year. And that's something they control how much they make. So they just pass a new law when they want to make more money. So when you've got somebody who's been in Congress for 20, 30 years, Joe Biden being one of those people, right, in the Senate, when you have somebody who's been around for that long, they have multiple millions of dollars worth in holdings. And they're using that money as their legacy, just like any other business owner would, right? But they're not always aware of how their money's being invested. And they've put it in the hands of some other investment group, right? And they've basically made the call, like, we want you to take higher risks or lower risks with our investment. So, before you know it, you have some very large holdings in some very shady places, just because of the nature of the fact that you're not managing your own money. You're up on the hill debating the finer points of abortion rights or whatever else it might be, right? So I'm not surprised at all. And I tend to lean into believing that our politicians are more compromised than we really think they are, because they are so heavily focused on one thing. They don't diversify their risks. They don't understand their money. That's not something they're used to doing. What they're used to doing is campaigning, winning votes, and then, horse trading behind closed doors on Capitol Hill. Does that mean? Yeah, go ahead.
Did the intelligence agencies kind of like push them in the right direction, so to speak? A lot of these people are, almost losing their mind. They're so old, right? I just saw Mitch McConnell like kind of just have a stroke on live TV.
That's exactly what I call it too, man.
Yeah, that's the perfect puppet, right? Like those are the perfect puppets, are people that can't think. Is there any truth to that? Do the intelligence agencies push them around and tell them what to do?
No, it's the other way around. That's what's so sad, man. Right? Like your intelligence agencies don't push around your policymakers. If anything, your policymakers set the policy priorities that your intelligence services then pursue, which I hope is even scarier to you when you think about it, right? You've got these old heads, not just physically old. I'm not ageist, but you've got these old heads that are used to doing things a certain way in a certain world that has certain rules, and they're being voted in by a group of by a constituency that's very small, but actually shows up to vote every 2 years. So this is what's driving the policymakers that then drive the entire intelligence community. They're the ones that tell NSA what to collect and CIA what to collect and NRO what to collect. They drive us. We are on the other side saying, why the hell are we looking into this? Like, this is ridiculous that we're comparing trade in rice and soybeans in Southeast Asia against, why are we collecting data about these different things, these agricultural needs, so that you can convince your constituency to vote you back into office again next year in Kansas or Missouri?
Right. Pushing ESG type of agendas and making sure that you follow through with it. I know you have a prior engagement, so I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want to give you an opportunity to say anything that we missed and where to find you, and how do I sign up to your services if I wanted to?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Darren. So the one thing that I would add that we didn't really talk to are the other currencies that I think are really worth paying attention to. You need to be watching XLM. You need to be watching XDC. I personally keep a close eye on QNT, on Quant, right? And I watch Ripple very closely as well. These are all currencies that are essentially there to enable and evolve the transactional power of our existing financial services and our existing financial institutions. Some of those are things people have never heard of those currencies before. People don't know they exist. And yet they're becoming the bedrock of a future compliant financial industry that's based in digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. So I wanted to make sure we flag that, because I think that's really something that's worth mentioning. There's a lot of hard work going into moving us in the direction of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies for the future. And then if anybody wants to find me, you'll be able to find me. If you just Google Andrew Bustamante, you'll find more than you need to know about me. Or you can visit me at everydayspy.com. That's my homepage. Or you can find me on whatever your favorite social media platform is, at Everyday Spy. And I also have a popular podcast for those of you who are in the podcast world, the Everyday Espionage Podcast. If you listen in on for audio podcasts, or if you're a YouTube person, just visit me at the Everyday Spy Podcast, and you'll find me on YouTube.
Well, thanks for coming on to the show. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your insights. I mean, you definitely have a unique perspective that I don't hear often. So thank you, Andy.
No, my pleasure. And thanks for having me, Darren.
I'm seeking to expand and elevate my channel. Your support, small or great, would go a very long way. Join patreon.com/fame21more or dmjr.ghost.io. They're mirrored sites and they offer the same exact content. One accepts Stripe and the other has a different payment process.